The headlines are focused on the South China Sea. The cameras are trained on the border. The pundits are arguing over the latest diplomatic spat in Brussels. But while the world looks east and west, the real structural shift is happening at the top of the globe. If you want to understand the next decade of global power, stop looking at maps. Start looking at bathymetric charts of the Arctic Ocean. Because what we are witnessing isn't just a seasonal thaw. It's the opening of a new multi-trillion-dollar theater of economic warfare. In my last analysis, we talked about Venezuela. We talked about how the administration's move to secure South American oil wasn't about democracy, but about economic containment, locking China out of the Western Hemisphere's energy supply and protecting the dollar. But that was only half the story. To secure the rear, you have to secure the roof. Greenland, the Northwest Passage, the Lomonosov Ridge, these aren't just cold, empty spaces. They are the gears of a new global machinery. Today, I'm going to show you the structural logic behind the Arctic Scramble. We're going to look at the three pillars of this conflict: the death of the Suez Canal, the commodity-backed challenge to the dollar, and why the United States is suddenly treating Canada not as an ally, but as a strategic obstacle. For over a century, global trade has been dictated by two choke points: the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. If you control the narrow waters, you control the pace of global capitalism. This has been the cornerstone of American naval hegemony, but the geography of trade is breaking. The Northern Sea route, stretching along Russia's coast, and the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic are no longer theoretical. They are functional. Shipping a container from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Suez takes roughly 35 days. Via the Northern Sea route, it takes 22. That 40% reduction in time isn't just a convenience. It's a death knell for the current maritime order. It means lower fuel costs, lower labor costs, and most importantly, it bypasses the American gatekeepers in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. China understands this better than anyone. They've dubbed it the Polar Silk Road. Since 2024, Beijing has invested over $90 billion in Arctic infrastructure. They aren't just building icebreakers. They are building a supply chain that is physically impossible for the U.S. Navy to blockade without triggering a total global war. When you see the United States ramping up pressure on Greenland or questioning Canada's sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, don't listen to the rhetoric about environmental protection. This is about the Suez pivot. Washington cannot allow the primary artery of 21st century trade to fall under the joint custody of Moscow and Beijing. If the trade routes move north, American leverage moves south, and the administration knows it. But trade routes are only part of the calculus. Let's talk about what's buried under the ice. The Arctic holds an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and a staggering 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. But in the age of the green transition, that's not even the most valuable prize. The real treasure is the critical minerals: neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, and dysprosium. These are the elements that power everything from F-35 fighter jets to the EV batteries in your garage. Currently, China controls nearly 90% of the global processing capacity for these minerals. They have a stranglehold on the future of energy. Enter Greenland. When the Trump administration originally floated the idea of buying Greenland, the media treated it as a joke. It wasn't. Greenland sits on one of the world's largest deposits of rare earth elements. By 2024, Chinese firms had already moved in, securing mining stakes and offering to build international airports. The American response has been a mirror image of the Venezuela strategy: economic containment. The U.S. is now using national security waivers to block Chinese investment in Arctic mining, while simultaneously pushing American firms to reshore the supply chain. But here is the petrodollar connection most analysts miss. Just like we saw in Venezuela, the goal isn't just to have the resources, it's to ensure they are priced in dollars. If China can buy Arctic gas and Greenlandic minerals using yuan, the American financial system loses its most powerful weapon, the ability to sanction its way to victory. The Arctic is the front line of the fight to prevent a commodity yuan from emerging. This isn't a trade war, it's a currency war fought with drill bits and icebreakers. Now, let's look at a layer that makes people uncomfortable: the friction between the U.S. and its closest neighbors. In the Venezuela script, we discussed how the U.S. is consolidating the hemisphere. That consolidation doesn't stop at the Rio Grande. It goes all the way to the North Pole. For decades, the United States and Canada have had a polite disagreement over the Northwest Passage. Canada says it's internal sovereign water. The U.S. says it's an international strait. For 70 years, it didn't matter because the water was frozen. Now it matters. If the Northwest Passage is an international strait, the U.S. Navy can sail through it without asking permission. If it's Canadian water, Canada, which has a much more nuanced relationship with Chinese investment, can set the rules. We are seeing a subtle but aggressive shift in Washington's stance. The U.S. is moving to standardize Arctic security. This is code for "we are taking charge of the perimeter." Just as the U.S. signaled to Latin America that moving too close to Beijing has consequences, it is signaling to its northern allies that Arctic security is a non-negotiable American interest. This is strategic husbandry in its purest form. The United States is clearing the board. It is making sure that if a conflict with China erupts in the 2030s, the rear, South America, and the roof, the Arctic, are locked down, dollar-denominated, and under American surveillance. So what does this mean for the person watching this on their phone? What does it mean for your portfolio? In the short term, the Arctic premium is going to drive a massive surge in specialized industrial sectors. We are seeing a CapEx, capital expenditure, boom in ice-class shipping, subsea mining technology, and satellite telecommunications. Companies like those involved in polar-hardened infrastructure are the new defense contractors. But there's a risk the markets are ignoring. The just-in-time global economy relies on the predictability of the Suez and Panama routes. As trade shifts to the Arctic, we are entering an era of geopolitical seasonality. If a Russian icebreaker denies passage to a Western vessel, or if a U.S.-China standoff occurs in the Bering Strait, the supply chain doesn't just slow down, it breaks. We are moving from a globalized trade model to a fortress trade model. As we look toward 2026 and beyond, the Arctic endgame boils down to three possible paths. Path 1, the condominium. The US, Russia, and China reach a cold peace. They agree on a set of rules for the Northern Sea Route, much like the Antarctic Treaty. Resources are extracted, trade flows, and the Arctic becomes a neutral economic zone. This is the optimistic scenario, but it requires a level of trust that currently doesn't exist. Path 2, the Great Partition. The Arctic is split down the middle. A NATO-plus zone in the west, Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and a Sino-Russian zone in the east. This would lead to a massive duplication of infrastructure, higher shipping costs, and a permanent military standoff at the pole. Path 3, the frozen conflict. This is the Venezuela scenario applied to the north. The U.S. uses its financial and naval weight to delegitimize Russian and Chinese claims. Sanctions are applied to any ship using the Northern Sea Route. Insurance markets in London and New York refuse to cover Arctic transit that doesn't follow American safety protocols. The Arctic becomes a dead zone for global trade, not because of the ice, but because of the politics. The story of the Arctic isn't about polar bears or climate change, and it's not about exploration. It's about the same thing the Venezuela operation was about: control. Control over the routes that move goods, control over the currency that buys resources, and control over the strategic depth of the Western Hemisphere. The administration calls it securing the future. Critics call it the new imperialism. But the mechanics are indifferent to the labels. The logic is structural. Secure the supply lines, control the pricing systems, and deny the competitor access. The headlines have moved on from the North Pole, just like they moved on from Maduro, but the real story is just beginning. The roof of the world is being bolted shut, and if you aren't watching the Arctic, you aren't watching the board.